The air inside the Key Club was always thick, a comfortable blanket of old wood, polished brass, and the ghost of 1,000 cigarettes smoked in decades past. On a Wednesday night, it was more than just air. It was an atmosphere, a living thing that settled deep into your bones. Tonight, the living thing was content. It hummed with the low murmur of conversations, the gentle clinking of ice against glass, and the soft, expectant silence that always fell just before the man in the corner took his stand. His name was Alfie Sterling, and to the regulars, he was as much a part of the club as the scarred bar or the crooked picture of a jazz trio hanging behind it. At 72, his hair was a refined silver crown, and his face was a map of a life lived with gusto, etched with lines that fanned out from his eyes when he offered one of his rare, genuine smiles. He wore a dark blue blazer that seemed tailored not just for his body, but for his reputation. When Alfie Sterling was on stage, the club didn't just have a performer. It had a king. He didn't rush. He picked up his trumpet, a gleaming silver instrument that seemed to catch and hold the dim light of the club, turning it into something brilliant. He called her the lady, and he treated her with the deference a knight would give his queen. He ran a soft, clean cloth over her one last time, his long, skilled fingers moving with a practiced grace that was a performance in itself. Then he brought the trumpet to his lips. There was no need for a countdown, no nod to the bass player or the drummer. They knew. They had been playing with him for years. They knew his breath like their own. The first note was a clarion call, sharp and clean, cutting through the haze of the room like a knife. It was a fast, complex number, a dizzying cascade of notes that tumbled over one another in a joyful, breathtaking race. His fingers, though spotted with the faint brown marks of age, danced across the valves without a moment's hesitation. They were a blur of motion, a perfect fusion of man and machine. He wasn't just playing the notes. He was sculpting them in the air, giving them shape and life. He'd close his eyes, not in concentration, but in a kind of ecstasy, as if the music was a place he was visiting and he wanted to soak it all in. The crowd responded. They didn't just listen. They felt it. A woman in a red dress who had been laughing loudly with her friends just moments before now leaned forward, her chin resting on her hands, a small, blissful smile on her face. A man at the bar who had been staring into his glass found his foot tapping out an intricate rhythm on the brass footrail. This was the magic of Alfie. For the 5 or 6 minutes he held the stage, the worries of the outside world melted away. There was only the pulse of the bass, the gentle sway of the brushes on the snare drum, and the soaring, impossible beauty of the trumpet line. When the final, triumphant note hung in the air and faded into a warm silence, the room held its breath for a second before exploding. The applause was thunderous, a wall of sound fueled by genuine admiration and a little bit of awe. People were on their feet, whistling and calling his name. Alfie opened his eyes, the spell broken, and offered a small, almost regal bow. He wasn't boastful. His confidence was so absolute, so deeply ingrained, that it came across as a simple, unshakable fact of life. The sun rises, the river flows. And Alfie Sterling is the best trumpet player in town. He made his way back to his corner table, accepting pats on the back and appreciative nods along the way. An old friend, a woman named Eleanor, who had been coming to hear him play since she was a young woman, intercepted him. "Alfie, you beautiful man," she said, her voice full of warmth. "You do that on purpose, don't you?" "You try to stop our hearts?" Alfie chuckled, a low, rumbling sound that seemed to come from deep in his chest. "Just keeping you on your toes, Eleanor. Can't have you falling asleep on me?" "Never," she promised, squeezing his arm. "Every time, it's like the first time." He smiled, a genuine one this time, and continued to his table. He loved this. He loved the respect, the quiet reverence, the feeling of being at the absolute center of his own small, perfect universe. The Key Club was his kingdom, and these were his loyal subjects. He had played in bigger cities for larger crowds, but this was the place that mattered. This was where he was king. Around midnight, Sal, the club's owner, a portly man with a perpetually cheerful face and a sharp mind for business, clambered onto the small stage. He tapped the microphone, causing a little feedback screech that made everyone wince. "All right, settle down, you heathens," Sal said, his voice booming through the speakers. "I know you're all here to listen to the master, but I've got an announcement." He gestured broadly towards Alfie's table, and another round of applause rippled through the room. Alfie raised his glass in acknowledgement, a look of calm expectation on his face. "As you all know," Sal continued, "it's that time of year again. Time for the annual Key Club Showcase, our friendly little competition to find out who's got the chops to share the stage with our very own legend." The announcement was met with an excited buzz. It was a tradition, one of the highlights of the year for the local music community. It gave aspiring musicians a chance to dream, and it gave the audience a night of variety and surprise. For Alfie, it was a formality, a coronation. He had won it 10 times in the last few years. The competition had felt less like a contest and more like a solo performance with a very long and very respectful opening act. "Sign-up sheet is right here at the bar," Sal said, slapping a clipboard onto the worn wood. "Showcase is in 2 weeks. Let's see what you've got." Alfie watched as a few younger musicians, emboldened by the drinks and the atmosphere, made their way to the bar. He saw a nervous-looking young man with a guitar, a woman with a powerful voice who sometimes sang with the house band. They were good, passionate, but they weren't in his league. He knew it, and they knew it. He finished his whiskey, the burn of familiar comfort, and decided he might as well get it over with. He stood, straightened his blazer, and walked towards the bar with a slow, deliberate stride. People parted for him, a silent acknowledgement of his status. He picked up the pen attached to the clipboard. It was a cheap plastic ballpoint, the kind that leaked a little. He disliked it. He liked things to be solid, to have weight. With a flourish of his wrist, he signed his name at the top of the nearly empty list. Alfie Sterling. The letters were sharp, confident, and unmistakable. He gave Sal a nod, who winked at him. "Glad to have you on board, Alfie. Wouldn't be the same without you." "Of course not," Alfie said, a hint of amusement in his voice. He decided to linger for a moment, curious to see who else would throw their hat in the ring. He leaned against the bar, ordering another drink, and watched the names slowly fill the space below his. He recognized a few. Dave on the sax, always a little too frantic. Maria, a singer with a lovely voice but a crippling case of stage fright. They were all fine. They were all predictable. He was about to turn back to his table when a new name, written in small, neat handwriting near the bottom of the page, caught his eye. Clara Jenkins. Beside her name, in the same careful hand, was a small, simple drawing of a trumpet. Alfie stared at it. A trumpet player? He felt a smile twitch at the corner of his mouth. He didn't recognize the name at all. He tried to picture her. He imagined someone young, probably a student from the local university. Maybe a girl who played in the marching band, thought she could handle the real deal because she could hit a few high notes in the football stadium. He pictured her with a brand new, shiny student model horn, looking terrified. She probably knew a few scales, a simplified version of Autumn Leaves. The thought was almost charming. It was like watching a child challenge a heavyweight champion to a boxing match. You couldn't help but admire the spirit, even if the outcome was a foregone conclusion. He took a slow sip of his new drink, the glass cool against his lips. This competition, he thought, was getting more interesting. It wasn't just a display of his own mastery. It was an opportunity. An opportunity to teach. To show this young woman, and the rest of them, what the art form was really about. He already knew the piece he would play. Something fast. Something impossibly complex. A number that would require not just skill, but fire and authority. A song that would leave no room for debate. He pushed himself away from the bar and walked toward the exit, feeling the weight of his kingdom on his shoulders. The night air was cool and crisp as he stepped outside, a welcome change from the club's stuffy warmth. He walked the few blocks to his apartment, his footsteps echoing on the empty pavement. His mind wasn't on Clara Jenkins. She was a fleeting, amusing thought, a minor detail in a story he already knew the ending to. He was thinking about the sound of the lady in his hands, the way she would sing under his command, the way the crowd would rise to their feet once again for their king. He was already savoring the victory, and the competition was still 2 weeks away. He had absolutely no reason to think it would be any other way. The trumpet case didn't gleam. It didn't command attention. It was a tired black canvas bag, scuffed at the corners and bearing a faint, sweet smell of mothballs, and something else, something deeper and warmer, like pipe tobacco and old wood. For Clara it felt heavier than it should, weighted down with memories as much as with the brass instrument nestled inside. She had carried it from her small apartment to the bus stop. And now, as she stood across the street from the Key Club, the case felt like an anchor, holding her in place while a sea of strangers flowed past her into the warm, inviting glow of the club's doorway. She was 22 years old, and the world felt like a place built for people who knew what they were doing. People like the man she had seen through the window, the one with the silver hair and the confident smile. He moved like he belonged, like the air and the furniture were arranged just for him. Clara felt like she was visiting a country where she didn't speak the language. She wasn't here to compete, not really. The thought was almost funny. To compete would imply that she thought she had a chance, and she knew she didn't. She was here because of a promise made to a ghost. 3 months ago, her grandfather, a man named David, who had worn the same comfortable sweater for the last 20 years of his life, and whose hands were always stained a little with ink from the post office, had passed away. He was a man of simple routines. He'd get up before the sun, sort the mail with a quiet efficiency, come home, and for an hour before dinner, he would sit on his small front porch with his trumpet. He wasn't a professional. He had never played in a club like this. He had played for the birds, for the wind, for the little girl sitting on the steps next to him, swinging her legs and watching his fingers dance. He never taught her music theory or how to read a complex chart. He taught her how to breathe. "Not from your chest, kiddo," he would say, his voice a gentle rumble. "From your belly. From your toes. Think of the air as a long, lazy river, and you're just letting it flow up through you." He taught her that a wrong note wasn't a mistake. It was just a suggestion. "The horn knows what it wants to say," he'd told her once, wiping a smudge from a valve. "You just got to be quiet enough to hear it." The last time she saw him, he was frail, his breath shallow. He pointed a shaky finger towards the canvas case, leaning against the wall in the corner of his room. "Don't let that horn get dusty, Clara," he'd whispered. "It's still got a lot of songs left in it. Songs only you can hear." The promise she made was silent, a tear tracing a path down her cheek as she held his thin hand. For 3 months, the case sat in the corner of her own small apartment, a silent reproach. She was afraid to open it, afraid that without him, the music would be gone, afraid that the horn wouldn't speak to her, that all she would hear would be the sound of her own inadequate breath. But one night, scrolling through a local events page on her computer, she saw the ad for the Key Club showcase. The name of the club stirred something in her. Her grandfather had mentioned it once, a wistful look in his eye. "Now that's a real place," he'd said. "A place where the music is honest." Maybe this was it. Maybe this was how she could keep her promise. Not by winning, but by being brave enough to play his horn one time in a place he would have loved. It was an offering. A way of saying, "I'm still listening." Taking a deep, shaky breath, a poor imitation of the lazy river her grandfather had described, Clara crossed the street and pushed open the heavy wooden door. The noise and warmth hit her at once. It was exactly as she had imagined, filled with chatter and laughter and the low, pulsing thrum of a life being lived. She felt instantly out of place, a quiet, drab creature in a world of vibrant color. She clutched the handle of the old case and made her way to the bar. Her eyes down, trying to be invisible, she saw the clipboard on the bar and hesitated. Writing her name felt like a final, terrifying commitment. She thought about turning around, going back to the safety of her apartment. But then she saw the name at the top of the list, written in that bold, unmistakable script, Alfie Sterling. So that was his name. Seeing it there so confident and alone made her heart pound even harder. It was like signing up to run a race against an Olympian. But it also felt right. He was the real deal, and this was a real place. This was where her grandfather's horn deserved to be played. With a hand that trembled slightly, she took the plastic pen and wrote her name in the small space at the bottom of the page. Clara Jenkins. And then, on an impulse, she drew the little trumpet. It felt like a secret handshake between her and her grandfather. She paid the small entry fee and found a small, unassuming table in the back tucked into a shadowy corner where she hoped she could remain unnoticed. She ordered a soda water, her throat too dry for anything else, and just watched. The club started to fill up. A man with a guitar took the stage first, his voice earnest and his fingers flying over the frets. He was good. The crowd applauded politely. Then a singer went up, a woman with a powerful, soulful voice. She was better than good. The crowd was more enthusiastic, and then it was time for the man she had seen from the street, Alfie Sterling. The energy in the room shifted as he walked to the stage. It was a subtle change, like the air pressure dropping before a storm. Conversations quieted. People turned in their seats. This was the moment they had all been waiting for. Clara watched him, mesmerized. He moved with an absolute lack of self-doubt. He picked up his silver trumpet, and it seemed to gleam under the stage lights like a holy relic. When he played, it was everything she feared and more. The music was a dazzling, intricate storm. It was technically perfect, a breathtaking display of speed, power, and control. Each note was a polished gem, placed with expert precision. He didn't just play the trumpet, he commanded it. The instrument was a weapon, and he was a master swordsman, executing impossibly complex maneuvers with effortless grace. The crowd adored it. They roared their approval, whistling and shouting bravo. He was, without question, a master. Clara felt a cold knot of dread tighten in her stomach. What was she doing here? Her grandfather's music was the opposite of this. It was slow, sometimes clumsy, full of pauses and breaths. It was the sound of someone feeling their way through a memory. This was a sound-off, a display of sheer, overwhelming force. She felt like someone who had brought a small, hand-carved wooden boat to a naval battle. It was ridiculous. She felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes, a mix of fear and a deep, piercing sadness. She had let him down. She was about to make a fool of his memory, to offer his simple, beautiful songs to a king and his court. And they would be laughed out of the room. She listened as a few more performers took their turns. They were all talented, dedicated musicians, but none of them could touch the sheer force of Alfie Sterling's performance. He was the benchmark, and everyone else was just a variation on a theme. She saw him sitting at a corner table, accepting drinks from strangers, basking in the glow of his own legend. He looked exactly like a man who knew he had already won. She looked down at the canvas case resting by her feet. Her grandfather's hands, gnarled and kind, rested on that same case every evening. She thought of the sound of his music on a summer night, the way it mixed with the chirping of crickets. She thought of the feeling of his breath, warm and alive, showing her how to find the air from her toes, her name was called. It sounded distant, like someone was saying it from the end of a long tunnel. The polite, sparse applause that followed was a soft, pitying sound. She stood up on legs that felt unsteady. This was it. Too late to turn back now? She was a girl with a memory and a beat-up horn, walking into the lion's den. She didn't look at the crowd or at the king in the corner. She kept her eyes on the dusty wooden floor, one foot in front of the other as she made her way to the stage, carrying the promise of a quiet man on a porch. Against the sound of a thunderstorm, the MC was a large, friendly man named George, with a voice that was a little too loud for the intimate space of the Key Club. He was trying his best to keep the energy up between acts, telling jokes that were more endearing than funny and calling out for more drinks for the musicians. The crowd was in a good mood, buoyed by the steady stream of music and the low, comforting hum of conversation. They were a warm audience, the kind that wanted you to succeed. But tonight, their patience was wearing a little thin. They had come for the showcase, but they were really waiting for the coronation. Every performer who took the stage was in their own way. An obstacle to be cleared before Alfie Sterling could be crowned the winner again. A young man with a piano played a beautiful, melancholy piece that was technically stunning but lacked a certain fire. The applause was warm but respectful. A duo with a cello and an acoustic guitar performed a lovely, intricate folk tune. It was the kind of music you'd listen to on a rainy Sunday afternoon, and the crowd appreciated its gentle charm. But it wasn't jazz. It wasn't the raw, sweaty, heart-pounding sound they craved. It was an appetizer, and they were all getting hungry for the main course. Through it all, Alfie sat at his corner table, an island of serene confidence. He was a gracious spectator, applauding each performer with a polite, almost fatherly air. But to anyone who watched him closely, it was clear his mind was elsewhere. He swirled the amber liquid in his glass, the ice cubes clinking a soft, rhythmic counterpoint to the music on stage. He would nod along, a faint, knowing smile on his lips, as if he were a seasoned chess master watching novices move their pawns. He wasn't being cruel. He was simply existing in his own reality, a place where his own mastery was the undisputed law of the land. He noticed the young woman in the back, the one with the canvas case. She had been hiding in the shadows, nursing what looked like a soda water for the last hour. He had seen her name on the list, of course. Clara Jenkins. The little drawing of the trumpet had amused him. It was like a child's signature on a legal document. He watched her now, small and still, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and focus. He felt a flicker of something, not quite pity, but a sort of distant academic curiosity. He wondered what her story was. Maybe she was a student, fulfilling an assignment. Maybe she was a romantic, who had seen one too many movies about undiscovered talent. He decided she probably played with a thin, reedy sound, the kind that comes from not knowing how to breathe properly. He almost felt bad for her. Almost. George's voice boomed through the speakers again, pulling Alfie from his thoughts. All right, folks. We've got one more performer for you tonight before our judges go and have a very difficult, and I'm sure very spirited discussion. A few people in the crowd chuckled, glancing knowingly at Alfie's table. Let's give a warm Key Club welcome to our final contestant of the evening, Clara Jenkins. The name hung in the air for a second. A murmur rippled through the audience. Heads turned, a sea of faces searching for the source of the unfamiliar name. They found her in the corner, a small figure rising from a dark table. The applause that followed was sparse and hesitant. It was the sound of people being polite. It was the sound you make when you see someone walking up to the high dive board and you don't want them to feel bad if they decide to climb back down the ladder. Clara felt the weight of 100 curious eyes on her as she walked toward the stage. The path from her table to the 3 steps leading up to the platform felt longer than a city block. The wooden floor, which had seemed so charming from a distance, now seemed to have 1,000 splinters waiting to trip her. The case felt heavier than ever, a clumsy, awkward burden. She kept her gaze fixed on the floor, not out of shyness, but because she was afraid if she looked up and saw Alfie Sterling watching her with that cool, analytical look, her courage would evaporate completely. She mounted the steps and stood in the center of the small stage. The single spotlight felt hot and unforgiving, a circle of interrogation. She could see the shapes of the audience in the dark, a forest of silent, waiting faces. Her heart was hammering against her ribs, a frantic drumbeat that had nothing to do with the rhythm of any song. She placed the canvas case on the floor and knelt to unzip it. The sound of the zipper, a slow, deliberate zizzip, was unnaturally loud in the quiet room. She lifted out the trumpet. It was a beautiful instrument in its own way, but it wasn't a gleaming modern Selmer. It was an older model, a King's silver flare, its brass worn smooth in places where her grandfather's hands had held it most. There were tiny dents and scratches, each one with a story. One near the bell was from the time he'd dropped it while chasing after the ice cream truck. A series of small marks on the 3rd valve slide were from his thumb, rubbing the metal thoughtfully as he tried to remember a melody. To Clara, these imperfections were its beauty. To the crowd, they must have looked like signs of neglect, of a cheap, uncared-for instrument. From his table, Alfie watched her bring the horn to her lips. He leaned back in his chair, a look of profound boredom settling over his features. He took a slow, deliberate sip of his whiskey, the glass cool against his fingertips. He was ready to endure this. He saw the way she held it, a little tentatively, her shoulders slightly hunched. He saw the worn-out horn. It was a pathetic sight, he thought. An amateur playing on a relic? It was almost an insult to the stage. He was already composing the gracious, slightly condescending compliment he would give her if he happened to pass her on his way out. Something like good effort. Keep practicing. The MC, George, gave her a final encouraging nod and retreated to the side of the stage. The room settled into a state of quiet, low expectation. People shifted in their seats. A few checked their phones. A waiter quietly cleared a table near the back. The silence was not one of anticipation, but of politeness. They were waiting for it to be over. Clara stood there, the cold metal of the mouthpiece pressing against her lips. She could feel a tremor in her hands, a vibration of pure, unadulterated fear. She closed her eyes, shutting out the room, the faces, the expectations. She tried to remember her grandfather's words. From your toes. Think of the air as a long, lazy river. Her breath felt anything but lazy. It was short and sharp and caught in her throat. She felt the ghost of his hand on her back, a gentle, steady pressure. Just breathe, kiddo. It's just a song. She took one more shallow breath, and then, as if she had no other choice, she began to play. The first note that came out was not the confident, sharp call of a master. It was soft, a little breathy, and it wavered just slightly. It was the sound of a question, not a statement. A few people in the audience shifted, a small, collective sigh of here we go. Alfie didn't even change his expression. It was exactly what he had predicted. A hesitant, amateurish start. He raised his glass again, ready to tune out the next few minutes of mediocrity. But then, something strange happened. She didn't launch into a jazzy improvisation. She didn't try to compete with the lightning-fast runs or complex harmonies that had defined the evening. She played something else. It was a melody. A simple, achingly beautiful melody. It was a lullaby. The notes were clean and pure, but they weren't perfect. There were tiny slides between notes, gentle scoops and falls that would have been marked as errors in a music school. But here, in this moment, they felt like whispers. They felt like secrets. The song had a strange, mournful quality, but underneath it was a current of profound, unshakable love. It was a tune no one in the room had ever heard before, yet it felt instantly familiar. It felt like a memory they didn't know they had. The clumsy chatter of the bar, the clinking of ice, the distant hum of the traffic outside, all faded away. The air in the club, which had been so thick with smoke and expectation, suddenly felt clear and clean. The song was a thread, and it was pulling everyone into its quiet, gentle world. The effect on the audience was immediate and profound. The woman in the red dress, who had been tapping her foot to Alfie's complex rhythms, now sat perfectly still, her hand resting over her heart. The man at the bar, who had been lost in his drink, slowly turned on his stool, his eyes closed, look of deep concentration on his face. A young couple, who had been whispering to each other, fell silent, their heads leaning together as they listened. And at the corner table, Alfie Sterling froze. The glass was halfway to his lips, and he stopped, his hand suspended in midair. The look of boredom on his face dissolved, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated confusion. This wasn't what he was expecting. This wasn't bad music. It wasn't amateurish. It was something else entirely. It was so simple, so nakedly honest, that it disarmed him completely. He wasn't hearing notes anymore. He was hearing a story. He was hearing a memory. He was hearing a porch swing, and the smell of cut grass, and the feeling of a small hand in his. He was a boy again, listening to his own father play a tune just like this one. A tune that had nothing to do with performance and everything to do with comfort. He put his glass down on the table. The sound a soft, final click in the now silent room. For the first time in a very long time, Alfie Sterling was not the king. He was just a man in a dark club, listening to a girl with a beat-up horn play a lullaby that was breaking his heart. He had spent his entire life building walls of technical perfection, of dazzling skill and commanding presence. And in less than 30 seconds, this young woman had walked through those walls without even trying. She wasn't trying to impress him. She wasn't even playing for the audience. She was playing for someone who wasn't there, and that made it the most real thing he had ever heard. The room was no longer his kingdom. It was hers. And he, like everyone else, was just a guest. Asterisk, the final note didn't so much end as it did evaporate. It hung in the air for a moment, a fragile, shimmering thing, and then it was gone, leaving behind a silence that was more profound than any sound that had come before it. For 10 full seconds, no one moved. No one breathed. It was as if Clara had cast a spell, and the only thing that could break it was the risk of shattering the memory of the song. The club was not a room full of people anymore. It was a single, collective consciousness, held suspended in a moment of pure, unguarded emotion. Clara stood on the small stage, her eyes still closed, the old trumpet resting against her lips. She was barely aware of the crowd. She wasn't in the Key Club anymore. She was on a porch, on a warm summer evening, the smell of honeysuckle heavy in the air. She could feel the gentle rock of the swing and hear the reassuring rumble of her grandfather's voice as he hummed along. She had poured every ounce of memory, every fiber of love and loss, into that melody. She had played for him, and for a moment it felt like he was there, listening. The silence that followed was his quiet, appreciative applause. Then, a single person started to clap. It was not the loud, enthusiastic clap of a jazz fan, but a soft, rhythmic clap, like the steady beat of a heart. It was the woman in the red dress. Her face was wet with tears, but she was smiling a deep, radiant smile. Another person joined in, then another, then another. It wasn't a wave. It was a slow, rising tide. The sound swelled, not into the thunderous, explosive applause that had greeted Alfie Sterling, but into something else entirely. It was a deep, resonant, almost reverent roar. It was the sound of catharsis. It was the sound of 100 people realizing they had just shared in something incredibly private and profoundly beautiful. People were on their feet, not because they were excited, but because it felt like the only appropriate response. It was a standing ovation of the soul. The bartender, a gruff man who had seen it all, was leaning over the bar, his face in his hands. The MC George stood frozen at the side of the stage, his jaw slack with disbelief. They hadn't just been entertained. They had been moved. They had been touched. Slowly, Clara opened her eyes. The sound rushed in, and the sight of the entire room on its feet hit her with the force of a physical blow. Her first thought was confusion. Had something else happened? Was there a celebrity in the room? She looked out at the sea of faces, all turned toward her, their expressions a mixture of awe and gratitude. And then it hit her. This was for her. For her song. For her grandfather's song, a fresh wave of emotions washed over her, so powerful it almost buckled her knees. It was relief, shock, and an overwhelming sense of connection. She'd been so afraid of being laughed at, of being seen as a foolish amateur. Instead, she had been seen. She had been heard. Truly heard. She felt a tear trace its own path down her cheek, a hot, surprising line on her cool skin. She managed a small, clumsy bow, her hand feeling numb as it gripped the old trumpet. It felt lighter now. The anchor had become a pair of wings. In the corner of the room, Alfie Sterling remained seated. He was the only person who was not standing. He was an island of stillness in a sea of motion. The glass of whiskey sat untouched in front of him, the ice long since melted, watering the amber liquid down to a pale, sad color. He didn't see the standing ovation. He didn't hear the roar of the crowd. All he could hear was the echo of that simple, haunting melody. It was a key turning a lock he had forgotten was even there. The lock opened onto a room in his mind he hadn't visited in 50 years. He saw himself as a boy, not much older than Clara, sitting on the stoop of his family's brownstone. His father, a tall, quiet man who worked on the docks, had an old cornet, its brass as worn and dented as the one Clara held. His father never played for anyone. He only played for his son in the evenings, after a long day of work. He played the same kind of simple, wordless melodies, tunes that smelled of the river and felt like the rough, gentle texture of his father's hand on his shoulder. Alfie had loved those songs. But as he got older, he had learned about music theory, about scales and chords and improvisation. He had learned that the real musicians were the ones who could play fast and loud, ones who could command a stage and silence a room with their technical prowess. He had started to see his father's simple tunes as primitive, as amateurish. He had become embarrassed by them. The last time his father had offered to play for him, Alfie, then a teenager brimming with arrogance and a new Selmer trumpet of his own, had scoffed. "That's kid stuff, Dad. I'm learning real music now." He had never forgotten the look on his father's face. It wasn't anger. It was a quiet, profound sadness that had cut him deeper than any angry word ever could. His father had put the cornet away that night and had never taken it out again. He had died a few years later, and Alfie had sold the old cornet without a second thought, using the money to buy a new mouthpiece he didn't really need. He had spent his entire adult life running away from that memory, burying it under layers of complexity, dazzling solos, of applause and admiration. He had built a fortress of perfection to keep out the ghost of that simple, loving sound. And tonight, this young woman, this stranger with a beat-up horn and a soul full of memory, had walked right through his fortress. She hadn't used a battering ram. She had just hummed the tune his father used to play. She had reminded him that music wasn't about being the best. It was about being true. It was about telling a story. It was about love. He had spent 50 years forgetting that, and in the space of 3 minutes, she had made him remember. The standing ovation wasn't for Clara. It was for the feeling she had given them all, the feeling of being connected to something real and simple and beautiful. And Alfie felt utterly, completely, and humbly defeated. The MC George finally found his voice. He had to wipe his eyes with the back of his hand before he could speak into the microphone. I don't know what to say," he stammered, his voice thick with emotion. "I think we all came here tonight to hear some music. But I think we just heard a story. Thank you, Clara. Thank you." He turned to the small table where the 3 judges sat. They were all looking at each other, their faces flushed, their usual cool professionalism completely gone. There was nothing to discuss. They didn't even need to fill out the scorecards. The competition wasn't just over. It felt like it had never really happened. The moment Clara had started to play, all the rules had changed. George stepped back to the center of the stage, holding the small wooden trophy that was supposed to be the prize. It looked so plain, so insignificant now. He raised his hands, trying to quiet the room. But the applause continued, fueled by a need to express something that words couldn't capture. All right, he finally managed, his voice finally regaining some of its strength. "The judges have informed me that this is well, it's the easiest decision they've ever had to make." He looked over at Clara, who was still standing on the stage, looking lost and overwhelmed. "The winner of this year's Key Club Showcase. The person who reminded us all why we fell in love with music in the first place is Clara Jenkins." The name was met with another explosion of sound. It was a confirmation of something they all already knew in their hearts. George motioned for Clara to come forward. She hesitated for a moment, as if she didn't understand. The MC had to gently guide her, placing the heavy wooden trophy into her hands. She looked down at it, her expression one of pure shock. It felt like a rock, a heavy, beautiful rock. She hadn't come for this. She had come to play a song for a ghost. Now she was holding a trophy in front of a cheering crowd, the ghost of her grandfather, standing right beside her, his hand on her back, a silent, proud smile on his face. She raised her eyes, scanning the room, not as a victor, but as a grateful witness to their shared emotion. And then, for the first time all night, she looked directly at the corner table. She looked at the old king, sitting alone in his dethroned kingdom. She couldn't read the expression on his face. It wasn't anger or disappointment. It was something else, something deep and quiet and unreadable. For a brief moment, their eyes met across the noisy, crowded room. It was a silent conversation. Strange and unexpected connection between the girl who had played a simple lullaby and the man who had spent a lifetime forgetting how to hear one. Alfie didn't look away. He just held her gaze, and in his eyes, she saw not the shadow of a defeated rival, but the faint flickering light of a long-lost memory. He gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. It wasn't a bow, it was an acknowledgement, and in that nod, he surrendered his crown not to her, but to the simple, honest, unforgettable power of a story told through music. The roar of the crowd eventually began to soften, transforming from a tidal wave into a series of gentle, lapping waves that washed against the shores of the small club. People started to talk again, but their conversations were different now. The loud, boisterous energy of before was gone, replaced by a quieter, more intimate hum. They were turning to each other, not to critique or analyze, but to share. To ask, "Did you feel that too?" They were no longer just patrons at a bar. They were fellow travelers who had been on the same unexpected journey, and now they were trying to describe the view. Clara stood on the stage, a small, heavy trophy feeling awkward and alien in her hands. The MC George had given her a gentle pat on the back before retreating, his work for the night done. The lights seemed a little too bright, the sounds a little too loud. She felt a strange sense of dislocation, like she had woken up in a dream she didn't remember starting. She had come to the Key Club to honor a memory, and instead, she had created a new one. One that now included a room full of strangers who felt, for a few minutes, like family. She didn't know what to do next. The logical thing was to leave the stage, to go back to her quiet corner table, and then slip out into the night. But her feet felt rooted to the spot. She looked out at the faces, and they were still looking back at her with a kind of awestruck warmth. She saw the woman in the red dress who was now smiling at her and wiping away one last tear. She saw the bartender who gave her a solid, respectful nod. They weren't looking at a winner. They were looking at the person who had given them a gift, and the only gift she had to give in return was to be present, to stand there for a moment longer and share the space with them. Slowly, she lowered herself to the floor, her movements stiff and unsure. She knelt beside the open canvas case, the ugly, beautiful bag that had started it all. With a care that was almost ritualistic, she began to wipe down the old trumpet. Her movements were slow, deliberate. She wasn't just cleaning it. She was putting it to rest. She was thanking it for speaking so clearly when she had so little faith in her own voice. As she polished the worn brass, she felt a sense of peace settle over her. She had kept her promise. Her grandfather's songs were not gone. They had just been waiting for a new ear, a new heart to hear them. She had been that ear, and a whole room full of people had listened. That was the real prize. A few minutes later, she finally packed the horn away, zipping up the case with a soft, final sound. She picked up the wooden trophy and stood up, ready to disappear. As she turned to leave the stage, she saw him. Alfie Sterling was standing at the bottom of the steps waiting for her. The sight of him sent a jolt of anxiety through her. She had seen his face as she played, the transformation from boredom to confusion to that unreadable, deep stillness. She had no idea what he was thinking. Was he angry? Humiliated? Ready to tell her she had gotten lucky, that she wasn't a real musician? She clutched the trophy to her chest like a shield and took a hesitant step forward. He didn't move, just watched her approach. He looked smaller now. Not physically smaller, but his presence, which had once seemed to fill the entire room, had shrunk to the size of a single person. The aura of invincibility was gone, replaced by something quieter, softer, and infinitely more human. The silver hair that had seemed like a crown now just looked like the hair of an old man who had lived a long life. The confident smirk was gone, replaced by a look of profound, weary sadness. She stopped on the last step, looking down at him. The distance between them was only a few feet, but it felt like a vast, uncharted territory. "You played," he said. His voice wasn't the booming, confident instrument she had heard from the stage. It was quiet, raspy, and fragile, like an old recording played on a scratchy phonograph. Clara just nodded. Not trusting her own voice, he looked past her. For a moment, his eyes unfocused, as if he were seeing something on the empty stage behind her. "My father," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "He used to play me that same tune. Not that one, but like that. Simple. On our front stoop." He shifted his gaze back to her, and in his eyes, she saw it then. The ghost of a little boy, sitting with his dad. He worked on the docks. His hands were always rough. He had an old cornet, just like yours, all dented and worn. Clara felt a lump form in her throat. She hadn't expected this. She hadn't expected anything like this. "I got good," Alfie continued, his words coming slowly, as if he were discovering them for the first time. "I learned all the hard stuff, all the fast notes. I thought that's what made you a real musician. I thought his songs were kid stuff." He looked down at his own hands, the hands that had commanded a stage and a crowd for decades. They looked old to him now. "One night, I told him that he never played for me again." The confession hung in the air between them, heavy and raw. It was a story that had nothing to do with her, and yet it had everything to do with her. She understood then what she had done. She hadn't just played a song. She had accidentally unlocked a door in this man's heart that had been bolted shut for half a century. "I haven't thought about that in so many years," he said, a faint, bitter smile touching his lips. "I've been playing for applause for so long, I forgot what it was like to just ... play because you had to. Because the song needed to be sung." Clara finally found her voice, though it was barely a whisper. "He was a postman. My grandfather. He played on the porch. He said music was just stories you couldn't tell with words." Alfie looked at her, a flicker of understanding in his eyes. "He was right," he said, his voice cracking slightly. "He was right." Took a small step back, giving her space. "You didn't come here tonight to win a trophy, did you?" Clara shook her head, the wooden trophy in her hands feeling suddenly very foolish. "I came to play a song for him, to keep it from getting dusty." "You did more than that," Alfie said, his gaze softening. "You reminded an old stubborn fool of what he lost. Don't you dare let that horn get dusty. You hear me? It's more important than any trophy." Held out his hand. It wasn't the hand of a conqueror claiming a prize. It was the hand of a pilgrim who had reached a sacred site and was asking for a moment of grace. Hesitantly, Clara reached out and shook it. His grip was firm, but his skin was thin and soft. It felt like shaking hands with history. "Thank you," he said, and the words were so full of weight and sincerity that they almost knocked the breath out of her. Then, without another word, he turned and walked away. Clara watched him go. He didn't go back to his corner table or to the bar. He walked straight for the door, a solitary figure moving through the dwindling crowd. He didn't say goodbye to anyone. He didn't stop to accept the condolences or the congratulations that a few people offered him. He just walked, his shoulders a little slumped, his posture no longer regal, but simply the posture of a man carrying a heavy load. The heavy door swung open, and he disappeared into the cool night air. Leaving a king's empty kingdom behind him, Clara stood there for a long moment, the club slowly emptying out around her. She thought about his final words. She looked down at the trophy in her hand, then at the canvas case at her feet. One was a symbol of winning. The other was a symbol of why she had come. Slowly, she walked over to the MC who was busy stacking chairs. She held out the trophy to him. "Here," she said, her voice still quiet. "I think this belongs to the club." George looked at the trophy, then at her, a slow smile spreading across his face. "No, kid," he said, his voice warm and kind. "I think you earned it. But I also think you've already got something better. Keep it." As a reminder, Clara wasn't sure what to say, so she just nodded and put the trophy back into her canvas case, and sling it beside the old trumpet. They made an odd pair, the cheap wooden award and the beat-up, priceless horn, but together they told the whole story. She walked out of the Key Club into the night. The air was cool and crisp, and the city sounds seemed distant and unimportant. She didn't go to the bus stop right away. Instead, she found a quiet bench in a small park nearby and just sat for a while, letting the night settle around her. She thought about Alfie Sterling, the old king who had walked out of his own castle. She hoped he was okay. She hoped he had gone home and found an old, dusty instrument of his own. She thought about her grandfather, and a small, genuine smile touched her lips. She had a feeling he was very proud. not of the trophy, but of the song that had been heard. When she finally stood up to walk home, the canvas case felt lighter than ever before. It was no longer an anchor or a pair of wings. It was just a trumpet, a beautiful, imperfect, story-filled trumpet, and she couldn't wait to play it again. Miles away, in a quiet, immaculate apartment, Alfie Sterling went to a tall, glass-fronted cabinet in his living room. He unlocked it with a small, ornate key. Inside, on a velvet stand, gleamed the silver Selmer, the lady, his instrument of power and victory. He reached in not for her, but for something that was tucked away in the back, in a box he hadn't opened in decades. It was an old felt-covered case, much like Clara's. He lifted the lid. Inside, nestled in faded blue felt, was a cornet, its brass dull and spotted with age, dented and worn. It was his father's horn. He lifted it gently. It felt clumsy and foreign in his hands. He brought it to his lips. He didn't try to play a fast run or a complex chord. He closed his eyes, ignoring the perfect, gleaming trumpet that had won him 1,000 nights, and he tried to remember. He tried to remember the sound of a lullaby on a front stoop, the feel of his father's hand on his shoulder, and the simple, powerful truth that sometimes the most important music is the kind you play for an audience of one. And for the first time in 50 years, a single, breathy, imperfect note echoed in the silent apartment. It was the sound of a king coming home.